Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to host this evening's webinar. And I will do my best to stay out of the way of the brilliance that is bound to emerge. Before we begin, we have some important business to attend to, and that is to make an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. At least I am where I am in my basement. These lands are the heartland of the Métis people, and we acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal 40 First Nation. Also acknowledge that we are enmeshed in a web of relationships that date back to then and inform our current understandings of each other and this place that we share. My primary job is to make sure that you know who you're going to hear from tonight. And I have detailed bios for each one of them that I'll get to in just a second. But I will tell you this: I am honored and very fortunate to know all of them. And I'm going to tell you a bit about them in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you this. At some point in the future, we will be allowed full freedom to go and be in places together. If you had the good fortune to go into one of those restaurants or coffee shops that are really crowded and they seat you with other people, or you have to awkwardly ask if you could sit with someone, and either Dr. Leanne Block, Rebeca Heringer, or Abdikheir Ahmed were one of the people you were seated with, you would remember that day for a long time. All three of them I know well enough and have learned from to say that you are in great hands. And so I'll move on to actually introducing things about them, but I didn't want to let the opportunity pass to express the honor I feel to know all three of them. So the order we're going to go in tonight, we'll follow. Rebeca is going to start. Abdi will follow, and Leanne will go after that. Each person will speak for 20 minutes. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers, which I'm looking forward to. The question and answer session. So you have two options on your screen to type things. One is in the chat, and the other is in the Q&A. We'll only be taking questions from the Q&A, and that's for a real practical reason. The chat tends to fill up real quickly, and then tracing up and down on it to find questions is tough. So please feel free throughout the presentation to record any questions you have in the Q&A. And then we'll be looking at those questions at the end, and I think we'll have time to dig into them. So without further ado, let me tell you about these three people. Rebeca Heringer. She is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. She has a bachelor degree in social communications and a master's degree in education. She's currently a sessional instructor at my place of work, the University of Winnipeg, where students benefit from her insights and energy. She's a research assistant and a writing tutor at the University of Manitoba. And thanks again to the University of Manitoba for organizing this excellent series. Her main research focuses are philosophy of education, well-being and well-becoming, anti-racist education, anti-oppressive research methodologies, psychoanalysis in education, hermeneutic phenomenology, community mobilization, and the internationalization of higher education. Besides previous formal experience as an English teacher in Brazil, Rebeca has worked with diverse minority groups in Kenya, Brazil, Hungary, and Canada. Welcome, Rebeca. You'll be the first to start, but I'm going to introduce Abdi and Leanne first. Abdikheir Ahmed, sorry, I just call him Abdi, is the executive director of the Aurora Family Center in Winnipeg. He has served in a number of capacities, including as Director of Policy at the Office of Canada's Minister for Families, Children and Social Development, executive director for Immigration Partnership Winnipeg. And I think where I first met him was executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba, otherwise known as IRCOM. He has extensive experience working with immigrant and refugee communities and designing and executing national social development policies. He's a passionate advocate for immigrants and refugees in Canada. And is active all the time, because every time I'm with him, he gets a phone call from somebody who needs his insight or his assistance. He's received numerous awards for his work creating life-changing opportunities for new Canadians. He was a CBC Manitoba Future 40 finalist. How old? Yeah, you're young. And is recipient of the Order of the Buffalo Hunt, one of the province of Manitoba's highest honors for his work in advocacy and building bridges. He has a master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, where he studied on a Rotary Peace Fellowship. Welcome, Abdi. Dr. Leanne Block is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. I can tell you that above everything else I'm going to read, she is a trusted mentor to novice faculty like myself. Her research focus is on how we name and engage with difference in educational settings. She's one of the founders of Kapama'ayak Achak Healing Forest, a living memorial to Indigenous children lost to the residential school system and an outdoor community learning place. I live 2 blocks away from this healing forest, which is located in St. John's Park. And a testament to Dr. Leanne Block's work is the fact that before this, I went for a bike ride and waved to 4 elderly folks who were drinking water, looking at the beautiful healing garden. If you haven't had an opportunity, go for a walk, go to St. John's Park and take a walk through it. It's been a regular place for people to gather and deal with the stress of this pandemic. So gratitude to everyone here. I will stop talking and ask Rebeca to start talking. We'll turn off our, we'll mute us presenter folks. We'll mute our screens and our mics. And we leave it in your hands, Rebeca. Feel free, folks in attendance, to put questions in the Q&A as we go.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Marc, for your very kind words. And I want to thank the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg and all the organizers of this series of webinars for the opportunity to be speaking about this important matter with you today. So as we talk about being connected with learners, a common term that appears in the literature and that I often hear among educators is community, and the importance of fostering community with students and their families. That is also evident in Bill 64, where the term community appears 151 times. However, despite its frequent use, I believe it's important to explore what community actually means and the extent to which Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act, promotes it. So, first of all, when we look at the etymology of the word community, its Latin origins are linked to the words common and communication. That also seems to be reflected in the current usage in the dictionary, as the Free Dictionary online evidences. But different from what the dictionary shows, education philosopher John Dewey argued that physical proximity does not constitute community. That means that having students in the same classroom or even providing students with what I think is best for them does not necessarily mean that there is community between teachers and learners. Rather, as Dewey observed, community exists only through participation in common understanding. But what does common understanding mean? I speak from a Levinasian perspective, which takes the other as someone who is infinitely and absolutely different, beyond comprehension. So the attempt to know, understand, categorize someone means trying to reduce the infinity of the other to what I can comprehend, possess, being thus an act of violence to their uniqueness, a totalitarian act, as Levinas would say. Therefore, rather than trying to define the other, it is my responsibility when meeting the student to uphold and respond to their uniqueness as it appears, without preconceptualizations and never being satisfied with what I think I know about that person. Dewey showed how communication is the heart of genuine education. And so from this perspective, community necessarily entails risk because it means not having control of the outcomes. Communication, and thus education, challenges discourses of efficiency, teacher-proof curricula, evidence-based education. In a similar vein, community means that standards and success ought to be constantly reconceptualized because the uniqueness of the other is not static and graspable. I can never have a comprehensive understanding of the other because their singularity is in constant flux. Therefore, participation in common understanding, or simply community, does not happen by informing learners who they ought to be and what success means to them. Community is not a unilateral process, but one whereby all parts involved are transformed. Community requires the upholding of authority, which means embracing the discomfort of unforeseen outcomes. The necessary risk of education, or what the education philosopher Gert Biesta would call the beautiful risk of education, is its unpredictability. Community requires openness to the unknown and recognizing that each learner has unique needs, strengths, and interests, and that success may look different for each of them. So what does Bill 64 propose? A quick scan through the government's documents is enough for anyone to see the pervasiveness of such claims, such as to improve student performance, promote better outcomes, increase achievement and success, and strengthen parental involvement. So at first moment, the goal is to make, quote, all Manitoba students to succeed no matter where they live, their background, or their individual circumstances, end quote, sound very promising. However, it's important to take a closer look at what is underneath such broad claims. What changes are being proposed from the former Public Schools Act? In terms of connecting with students and their families, one of the major changes proposed by Bill 64 is to have a formal parental engagement, quote, at the school level and in the design and oversight of the overall education system, end quote. This would be done through the implementation of school community councils, replacing the informal parent councils, and the creation of a provincial advisory council for education. I will discuss the extent to which these changes may foster community later. But when we analyze the discourse of these policies, it's easily noticeable what the focus of the changes are, namely measurement, evaluation, surveillance, standards, and outcomes. So while the term community, which appeared only 12 times in the Public School Act, appear more than 150 times in Bill 64, when we look at the occurrence of other terms, we can see that their conceptualization of community clearly distinguishes from what I previously presented. Just to clarify on this list, the asterisk mean the truncation of the terms, which would allow for its variance in my search. So as you can see, there have been no significant changes from the Public School Act in regards to fostering diversity, combating racism, or promoting students' uniqueness. But what we do see is a major focus on control, efficiency, monitoring, governance, surveillance, and measures. An evidence of the government's efforts in enforcing such standards can be noticed by how the bill presents an increased emphasis on punishment, time out, seclusion, physical restraint to be performed with, quote, progressive disciplinary tools. So looking at some specific examples, it's curious how the Better Education Starts Today report claims that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work now or for the future, but states that one of the 4 pillars for student success is improve learning and outcomes for all students across the province through high and measurable standards of excellence. Indeed, the pervasiveness of terms such as standards, achievement, success, and outcomes seems to be ontologically accepted as good and desirable. The standards themselves and who define what the standards should be is never questioned. In that way, Bill 64 does not promote an unconditional responsibility to each student's uniqueness that would challenge the system itself, something that would be necessary for a community, but rather promote a unilateral process of imparting benchmarks to define students' merit. One of the places where this becomes most evident is through one of the 10 imperatives for change, which is close achievement gap for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. While easily disguised as an ethical and respectful goal, what is actually being proposed by the government is closing the outcomes and gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, not challenging the curriculum, standards, or measures adopted. For instance, while the report claims that learning environments for Indigenous students must infuse culturally and evidence-informed strategies that embed Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, it is also heavily focused on making students better equipped with the relevant future-ready skills needed to succeed in tomorrow's workplace. But Indigenous scholars also argue that Indigenous scholars warn against materialistic education systems whose purpose is to be useful cogs in the economic machine, as Stonechild said. Other scholars also argue that neoliberal reforms like this are shaped by uncritical multiculturalism and thus allow assimilationist policies of Indigenous peoples, whereby to make them equal to non-Indigenous students implies stimulating their participation in the labor market. However, it's important to note that Indigenous belief systems are not only diametrically distinct from materialism, but also to the idea that progress is straightforward and upward. What seems to be proposed then is finding strategies to make Indigenous students conform to mainstream values and achieve mainstream standards, while values and standards themselves remain unquestioned and disguised under tokenistic representations of diversity. While similar analysis could be made about students with disabilities and other minority groups, the question that remains then is whose voice and perspectives are being considered when defining what success should look like for learners. At first glance, the proposal also seemed like a meaningful way to connect parents of marginalized students who are often judged by schools for not being engaged with their child's education in the ways expected. As the scholar Jared Safadeh explains, shared responsibility and the concept of community are central to any articulation of an anti-racist and anti-oppressive approach to transforming the school system. But in order for a community to exist, there must be communication, which is non-existent when one of the parts is taken as immovable, the one and only standard of success. Parents are to make sure that their children get the best education, but what constitutes good education is taken for granted, one that fulfills current economic and political rationales. The shortcomings of such actions can also be observed in the proposed act with the creation of Provincial Advisory Council on Education, which is to be comprised of one representative from each regional catchment area and one representative from the Francophone School Board. According to the report, this advisory council will provide the Minister of Education with direct parental advice on matters relating to the education system. It will ensure that the minister is able to take local considerations into system strategic planning and decision-making. What does not seem to be taken into account in this planning is the fact that the Manitoban visible minority population is largely concentrated in the province capital, Winnipeg. In fact, while 89% of Manitoba's visible minority population reside in Winnipeg, the proposed school district that will encompass Winnipeg will have only one parental representative on the Provincial Advisory Council. So how will this council ensure that parents of minority students are included and indeed driving conversations that are needed to bring about change? With only one representative, parents of various minority groups will likely have little to no power to influence decisions through the formal school community councils. It also remains to be answered what this consultation with parents entails and how these volunteer councils will ensure that parents whose languages and multiple work schedules which prevent them from participating or attending school meetings during business hours allow them to have decision-making power. As it seems, the current proposal runs the risk of, once again, privileging mainstream voices while silencing the already disadvantaged by the system, something that has already happened in previously in similar education reforms across the country. As a consequence of neoliberal discourses such as Bill 64, parents are required to develop self-sufficient and self-regulating children. However, as George Safadeh observed, the cult of individualism in accounting for school success also avoids any institutional responsibility for failure. So while the report emphasizes, quote, the need for belonging and community and the important role families and school play in this in student success and well-being, it also individualizes success and failure in a way that does not encourage community. Indeed, the strong investment in competition fostered by Bill 64's discourse foments performativity, not only across provinces and countries, but also among students. Within this rationale, success is not taken on an individual basis, but in relation to and against others. Therefore, any pursuit of community within the school, between teachers and students, and across families is neutralized, and the so-called underachieving students and their parents are the ones to blame for not reaching the infallible and immovable standards determined by the government. So after we take a closer look at what Bill 64 seems to propose on the surface, we actually realize that what is being proposed is a top-down approach that seeks to frame students into preconceptualized notions of success, improving the province's position on national and international rankings, and the prevalence of dominant voices in the decision-making process. While standards are not wrong in themselves and are arguably necessary for any institutional planning, the pursuit of community means acknowledging that standards and measures are not static. So what is alarming is how standards are taken in Bill 64 not as the rule of thumb, but as the scientific truth intended to describe the quality of education and inherent student success. Rather than acknowledging each student as an individual with unique abilities and interests, and that does how success may look different for each one, Bill 64 states that methods and procedures for assessment, standards and outcomes to be achieved, and the performance measures to be used are to be regulated by the minister and apply indistinctly to all students. However, community requires authority, not homogenization. That is, there can only be community when there is another besides me. Trying to fit the other into what I can comprehend means trying to make the other as another I, thus eliminating authority and consequently precluding the possibility of community. A passive tolerance of diversity, as Bill 64 evidences, is not enough either, because that can be just another hierarchical approach that accepts difference as long as it does not challenge the status quo. The clear message of Bill 64 is that the government is accountable for achieving standards and performance measures insofar as those are regulated by the minister. Therefore, While the government talks the talk of welcoming diversity with its tokenistic acceptance statements, the act as a whole evidences that the flexibility given to students' diversity is limited by the shores of the system. The success envisioned does not stem from students' subjectivities, but from the government's perspectives and intentions. And when success is defined a priori according to mainstream standards reflective of colonial imperatives, or when the government limits success to being market ready, the result is not community, but the reproduction of dominant voices. Conversely, connecting with students requires openness to the unknown and understanding that achievement and success cannot be defined by a certain echelon of society, but must be informed by each student's uniqueness. Not all forms of success can be measured, and different forms of success may require different measurements. Community, or a genuine connection with learners, require the active resistance to a totalitarian approach to students and rather embracing the necessary discomfort of education, which is the dissatisfaction that must accompany every response to the other in recognition that education is an imprecise and unpredictable process, not something that can be defined by today's market. Thank you.
That was a very hard act to follow. Thank you for that presentation, Rebeca. I'm hoping that I will be able to measure up to what you did. Can't find my glasses, my reading glasses. So I don't have a slide. Number one, I don't have slides to present. I'm also not an academic. I live the practical life in the community. And I'll tell you a story. I'm a storyteller. And I'll tell you my story and my view of Bill 64. And I'll give you a trajectory of what has brought me to this level. So I have worked with the newcomers in Manitoba for the last 18 years at different levels, with kids, with parents, with immigrants, with refugees, with people in low-income housing blocks, and with immigrants who come with lots of money. Immigration is not going away from Canada. Indeed, immigration is the hallmark of our economic and demographic growth in Canada. In Manitoba, for instance, if we did not have immigrants and refugees coming here, we will have a negative population growth, which means our economy will almost collapse. The schools that we see that are growing, the new schools that are being built in different neighborhoods in this city, and the expansion in our education system is mostly based on immigration. So as newcomers, immigrants, refugees who are newcomers to this country, we're not going away. We're here, and we're going to continue to be more, and our population is going to get diverse. So I'm going to speak to you from my experience with immigration. Every year in Manitoba, we get something the size of the population of Steinbach as newcomers coming to this province. That's a startling number. However, in the way that we carry out our activities and what we do in our education system and across all other sectors, we haven't changed much, and we continue to do things the way we have always done. I have been part of what is called the Newcomer Education Coalition, which has been advocating for newcomer kids in the school system, better education system, better processes, better supports, more diversity in the teaching fraternity, and better representation of the students in the teaching fraternity in our school system, as well as better resourcing of teachers. Over the years, there are quite a few things that I have struggled against in fighting for newcomer students, immigrants and refugee kids, what is called the e-credits, credits that we give to students just to pass them through the education system, through the school system, just because we are not able to support them as much as we can. I have fought for resourcing of teachers, creation of EL as a teachable course in the university, so that teachers have the necessary resources and tools to be able to teach the students that come to this country from different parts of the world. I have also worked against discrimination based on religion, understanding of mental health issues as, not treating kids as one size fits all. I have also fought against barriers for internationally educated teachers, and the lack of newcomer parental involvement in our schools. And lastly, the lack of representation in our school administrations, in the administration of our education system, to the extent that we only have 3 trustees in the 54 school trustees that we have in the province. So these are things that I've always wanted to, address in my work with communities as advocate for newcomer Canadians. When the Education Review Commission came about, I was excited. Change is good. Reform is also a good idea. I personally thought the reform idea was a good thing, and that this was a very good opportunity to address some of the challenges that I've just talked about, that newcomer immigrants and refugee students have faced. So the first opportunity I took to meet with Dr. Glaze when she came and when she came to the city and talked to her, she listened very well. I provided a whole background of what the newcomer kids, immigrants and refugee kids, especially refugee kids with interrupted schooling, were going through. She gave me a very keen ear. I gave a submission, collected a few individuals from the newcomer community under the Newcomer Education Coalition to meet with the Review Commission. Dr. Glaze struck me as a genuinely interested person, someone who's genuinely interested in the plight of newcomer and refugee students. I was very helpful, extremely helpful, I'll say. When the report came out, I was also very impressed somehow, because of all the other things that people, talked about, the inadequacies of the report in representing, the interests of Manitoba, the idea of abolishing school trustees and all these things. Out of all that, the few things that were quite of interest to me, there were 4 recommendations on newcomer immigrants and refugees that were captured in this report. These were things that I was looking for all along. These were: develop and implement specific career development programming to support academic achievement and successful graduation of immigrant, refugee, and newcomer children who transition into, through, and out of Manitoba's K-12 education system. This was good. Discontinue the use of English as an additional language credits in grade 11 and 12, and provide more relevant education opportunities for all the newcomer youth with interrupted learning, and provide the academic upgrading support they need to be successful at the next level. Require pre-service, this is what I was asking for, in service and ongoing professional learning to address human rights and EL issues and trauma-informed pedagogy training for educators to equip them with the competencies for educating immigrant, newcomer, and refugee students successfully. And finally, remove barriers and support the certification of internationally educated teachers. These were things that I saw, and I was very optimistic. Now my optimism has been diminished. I was very optimistic, but when I saw the Bill 64 and when it came out, my optimism, what I was interested in, what I was looking forward to, was watered down completely. I really wondered whether this government actually really believes that there is only one race in this province, or they really don't care. I really didn't know. I tend to think the latter, because they really don't care what's going to happen. One of the ways of creating inclusion is to allow the minority population see itself in service provision. For instance, you provide a space for folks from minorities. In this process, with the exception of what we presented, the 4 points that I picked from writing this from this report, which was quite good in my opinion, everything else was quite problematic in representation, because representation matters. When I looked at the review commission, this government actually did not see the demographic of the people who live in this province. The review commission, there is no one from racialized minorities or someone who understood the needs of newcomers. There was no expert on newcomer education. There was no one who came with the background of understanding kids with interrupted schooling, kids from refugee background, kids who have been trauma, and the kids who have never been in school but are going to school for the first time here in the teenage years. There was no one in the review commission. Again, representation, the parent engagement task force, no one again from immigrant, newcomer, refugee, or racialized minorities. What did I expect? I did not see anyone with this expertise. Now, the next thing that I did was to read the report, the bill. I have read through the bill, I've gone through it. It starts with some very colorful lines for that actually, you know, someone who hasn't gone through the rest of it will be enticed. You know, as an advocate for minorities, when I saw those words, the first few lines that I saw, whereas students are entitled to learn in a welcoming environment that respects diversity and nature's sense of belonging, this is good. And whereas the philosophy of inclusion is a foundational principle of the education system in Manitoba, and an inclusive system takes into account the diverse states of interest of the people of Manitoba, contributes to the development of fair, compassionate, and healthy and prosperous society. But on a closer look, this bill was quite troubling for me. There's a lot of trouble in it. First of all, despite the fact that in Manitoba we welcome over 15,000 newcomers, as many kids of refugee and immigrant background, despite the fact that we have diversity of kids coming to this province, there is not even one single mention of the word immigrant or refugee or newcomer student all through. Nothing on racism, on equity or poverty either. It seems to me that the bill itself was written for a specific population. Because the bill is aimed at marginalizing minorities, especially racialized minority, because I know the challenges that the indigenous population faces. A lot of people will talk about it. That's not to diminish, because there's a lot that needs to be done for indigenous populations that this bill does not address. I did not focus on it. My main focus is on immigrant and refugee populations and the impact of this bill on them. Of all the refugee kids who need support with their education, some of them with no prior schooling, some of them having been impacted by the existing policies that have really made it difficult for them to go through the system, the inadequacy of the resourcing of the teachers, the fact that we let the teachers down by not being able to provide the necessary financial as well as educational resources to put them in the front of these kids who are really challenged. With all this bill focuses on specific populations, treating Manitoba as one homogeneous society that does not see all these other people who are coming to this province. We haven't provided space for the newcomer students, the refugee students, their mental health needs, the many kids who come with trauma, whose needs, whose traumatic experiences require a different lens of approach, because even the clinicians who are trained here will not be able to understand. You will need clinicians who are resourced and trained differently to be able to respond to these needs. This is all nothing, appearing nowhere. The best example of discrimination by a government, of its own people, is by discrimination using policy legislation. We saw it with the Stephen Harper government, the previous conservative government, when they came up with what was called the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, with a tip line to report on barbaric cultural practices. It was a very traumatizing time for me personally, because my community was specifically singled out at that time. Now, this government specifically singles out a certain population as a community of privilege. Here's why. Why? Bill 64 is a classic legislation to discriminate against minorities. Number one, the Provincial Advisory Council on Education. We newcomers, immigrants, are already underrepresented in the system. The newcomer parents do not understand the education system. They do not engage with the teachers. The school is a high tower environment. They are not even welcome. Now we are launched into a new system where the little representation that they had in the school trustees, in the elected boards, all these are being wiped out to be replaced by an appointed authority by the minister. What makes it worse, if this appointed authority was representative enough, it's something that we'll have swallowed. The issue is the majority of the newcomer population, of the immigrant population in this province, lives in Winnipeg. From the 2016 census, Manitoba was home to 216,000 visible minorities. Out of this, 193,000 of them live in Winnipeg, which means about 90% of them live in Winnipeg. Now, with this advisory council, only one representative is going to come from Winnipeg. Whose interest is going to be represented in front of the minister and in the decision-making tables in this province when it comes to representing the kids, the minority kids, the African refugee kids who have struggled through trauma, who are really wondering how to go through the school system, who are suffering under the e-credit system, the teachers who are struggling to be able to respond to these kids and who don't have the resources, who is going to be their voice? It seems to me that this government is shame-proof and is not interested in the plight of the population of this province, but is interested in who votes for them, who are a small population outside the city of Winnipeg, who are diverse. Because when I look at the numbers of students in the province, for example, Winnipeg alone has over 100,000 kids. The rest of the province is about 78,000 kids. How do you justify that out of all these representatives, only one come from Winnipeg and the rest of them represent 78,000 kids? And out of all the disparities, the diversity of the kids, the challenges that they face, the poverty, the refugee, the trauma, all these kind of things, nothing for us as newcomers, as refugees, as immigrants, I believe, will make it to the decision-making body. It's a really, real tragedy in tries to discriminate, uses legislation to discriminate against people who don't actually have a voice and who have never had a voice and will not have a voice in the future. The last thing that I'll say is, there's one thing that's very clear. There's no doubt that newcomer kids are already struggling because the system has not provided for them. When you look at the demographic of our students, the hallways of our schools, the population of our kids is changing. The demographic of who our teachers is not changing. we still have a long way in terms of including internationally educated teachers and providing opportunities for all this. This bill will take us far back from where we are to where we have been 10 years ago, because I believe even where we have, so far as where we have come, to be able to bring in these students and to be able to bring in the supports that we have had, we will not be able to reach there. I will end by saying that this government has a curriculum for teaching EAL in the school system that has been sitting as a draft on the shelves of the bureaucracy for the last 18 years. Do I expect that curriculum to come forward, to be put in front of the kids, to be able to support, resource the teachers so that the newcomer kids, the refugee kids can get the best? I don't expect it. I think we need to get together to provide voice to the voiceless. Newcomer parents have nobody to speak for them. The newcomer kids have nobody to speak for them. They do not engage in the political system. They do not engage with the teachers. They do not engage with even with the school trustees. They are not going to engage with this so-called parent advisory council of the minister. So we need to say no. I'm already given up. One of the things that I was telling, we're talking with my colleagues, is they will go away with what they want. But I think we should not give up. We should pull down each aspect of this bill on its own separately and dismantle it on its own so that it does not go forward. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi, and thank you, Rebeca, for talking about the plight of those students. I used to teach kids who came here from everywhere, all over the world, and certainly working with them and their families was a privilege, but it was also problematic, because the last time education got reformed in my teaching experience in the 90s, what happened is I was an EAL nowadays teacher, and the funding, they cut teachers, and so there were none of us who were teaching ESL could stay teaching ESL. And so I've seen this pattern, what we're seeing, what you've described, what both of you have described, how the bill is designed for some kind of homogeneous student that doesn't even exist. And maybe shouldn't exist if it could exist. So my name is Leanne, in case you missed that earlier, and I'm going to talk to you from my experience, not just as an academic in the Faculty of Education, but my own experience as a teacher, a classroom teacher, as a parent, and as a grandparent, and about equity. So this is a photograph of a grade 5 student in the Healing Forest in 2018. And the kids came walking into St. John's Park, into this educational space we created there, each of them holding up a popsicle stick with a cutout identical orange t-shirt. And it really reminded me of being in grade 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and doing art where everybody had to do the same thing, the same Easter bunny and the same pumpkin. But then as the students came closer and sat down, I saw each student had written their own message on their t-shirt, their own message about what they wanted to think about on Orange Shirt Day. And this was one I quite loved, despite the spelling errors. I hope you are in the best care and health. So in those years, from when I was a student to when I was a student teacher to when I was a teacher to when I was a teacher of teachers, I've seen a lot of changes in the education system. And one of the most positive changes that I experienced as a teacher and as a parent was that children were encouraged to put their own words out and not just to copy things out of other people's notebooks. So one of the things that this bill describes children is it describes them as assets. And that to me is a kind of neoliberal, scary way of talking about kids. And I think that flavor is in a lot of what Rebeca spoke about and what Abdi spoke about, like getting kids ready for the market and making sure that they succeed on some kind of agenda that's not necessarily the agenda that is part of children's reality. And good teachers know that. So inequities matter, and teachers experience the impact of social inequities in their daily lives and in their ongoing planning and teaching process. And our teachers are working with their students, both the students on the margins and students of privilege, to address inequity. That's part of their job as curriculum developers. And they address it through students' lived experiences, their own students and other students' experiences of poverty, of homophobia, of racism. And because we have teachers who care about these issues and students who care about it, things happen in schools. Good things happen in schools, like gay-straight alliances and working on recycling, stuff that kids do to sort of reclaim the world that's falling apart in front of them. This lived experience of teachers and the lived experience of students was really brought home to me a couple of years ago when I was working. I do ongoing research at an inner city school on curriculum development with a group of teachers. And at one of our meetings, they said the custodian has a new job. And the custodian's new job is to check the school grounds for needles every morning early before the kids come. But they don't always find all the needles, so the teachers are teaching the kids, this is an elementary school, right, K-6, what to do if they find a needle. So these kinds of experiences are systemic issues that affect education, affect the daily lives of kids and teachers. So my question is, does this bill address these kind of inequities? And everyone before me and in some of the panels, earlier panels, have discussed how the governance structure, as it's described, does not deal with inequities. In fact, it reinforces existing inequities. The words poverty and inequity do not appear in the bill. Abdi mentioned that, and I didn't get all the words on Rebeca's slide, but I found the word equity once, maybe you found it twice, Rebeca. So this slide is something that most of you who are educators will be familiar with. These are the statistics on child poverty rates in Manitoba. And the child poverty rates in Manitoba are among the highest in the country. And one of the reasons for that is we also have a high population of Indigenous students. And Indigenous families have traditionally been marginalized and excluded from a lot of privilege and economic realities that get you out of poverty. I think it's important when you look at these statistics to look at what are the solutions or the possible solutions. What kind of education is going to address the needs of kids who live in poverty? And for Indigenous kids, it's become clear, very clear, that learning about their culture and their traditions and their history is going to help them connect. And learning Indigenous perspectives is going to help them see school as a place where they want to be. I wanted to add that aside from poverty affecting different groups in different ways, the experiences of the last year and a half have also identified how student populations, student communities where there's poverty, those students were at an even greater disadvantage and at risk during home learning because they didn't have the internet necessarily, or enough devices, or even the physical space to sit in and focus in on a Zoom class. So Bill 64, just some examples of how it fails, I guess, from my perspective, to deal with inequities. In section 135, they talk about bullying in schools and how we should have policies to stop bullying, but they fail to connect bullying to either poverty or homophobia or racism. So it's a very narrow definition of bullying and a very narrow, just limited way of looking at that problem. Section 140 requires principals to identify students who are at risk of disengagement from learning. But again, the state of being at risk is not linked to poverty or homophobia or racism or learning disabilities. Also, even though it identifies how we have to remove these students if necessary, it does not identify the kinds of supports needed for students in those situations. Section 146, this one just sort of, Section 146 states that the provincial authority may provide lunches with or without charge. What Section 146 doesn't do is talk about how many kids come to school hungry. So this is a picture from another inner city school that I used to work with teachers and kids there. And the teacher in that school and I started a garden in the back of the school. And that was kind of interesting and good. It was a grade 3-4 classroom. And then the teacher kind of took it to the next step and said she's going to start a cooking club with these kids. So she spent hours filling in grants to get the money to start a cooking club. And this was a very special cooking club. The kids not only learned to cook, but they would take home food for their family. So if they were a family of 4, whatever they cooked, they'd get enough to feed 4 people. If they were a family of 5, and so on. These kids learned a lot. I used to join some of the cooking club sessions, and they learned to feel good about themselves. They learned how to plan a meal. They learned how to scrape things and cut things safely. They felt incredibly competent as the year progressed, as their skills grew. So they were learning things and they were getting fed. And it seems to me that this kind of work with children, this understanding of the need for this kind of work with children is totally absent from the current plans for education. Especially since the planners don't seem to acknowledge that so many kids come to school hungry. So they do acknowledge in section 153, it says, the purpose of the community schools program is to support the capacity of the public education system to enhance the social, emotional, physical health, and well-being of students in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, so they can come to school ready to engage in learning and take full advantage. Well, the community school program that existed when I was a teacher was growing and growing until almost every school was a community school, no matter what neighborhood it was located in, because it was understood that the school had a lot to offer to the community and vice versa. And I think Rebeca spoke very eloquently about what community building is and how schools can be part of it. However, the bill, while acknowledging that not all students come to the table of public education equally well fed, it does not address the responsibility of public education to be part of the solution to socioeconomic disadvantages. And it does not address how differences in students require differentiation of curriculum resources and teaching. The homogeneity of the student body that seems to be addressed in this bill doesn't allow for those kind of differences. Public schools can reinforce and replicate privilege. It can reinforce and replicate a lack of privilege or marginalization. Or the public school system can construct environments for equitable relationships. Marc spoke at the beginning, you know, how we're all part of a web of relationships. And the more I teach, the more I see that those relationships that happen in a classroom or an outdoor classroom have lasting impact. And as Rebeca said, we learn from each other's differences. So this is from a lesson plan of one of the teachers I've worked with. And the teaching point was to celebrate culture and diversity. And the method was to make little booklets about values. Each student will create a circle book of Métis values, because they'd been reading different Indigenous authors, and one book was about Métis values. So this is one teacher, right? Well, not one teacher, she works with lots of teachers, but this is her efforts to include these Indigenous values, and for all the students in her room, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And this is the book that one of the books that came out of it. And these are grade 2, 3 students. This is the rest of the book. It's not a very long book. For me, this assignment, this lesson plan, this work, what these children produced was values. To talk about values when you're in grade 2 and 3 is in and of itself a really wonderful thing. Then they all shared their books with each other. So they got to share their ideas. And then this teacher recorded their sharing in a video, which you don't have to listen to tonight, but it was a gift of good teaching and good learning, and an important gift for those kids. So when I started teaching before the last major educational reform, I didn't know the word outcome. I had a degree in education, but outcome didn't exist. And I managed to teach for 10 years without knowing that word, outcome. I mean, I talked about goals or objectives or things like that, but I didn't know the word outcome. And I found it useful at times to look at outcomes in curriculum. But I know that learning is much more than meeting a set of outcomes. Standardized or non-standardized outcomes are not the be-all and the end-all of learning. From what I've learned, learning is a multi-layered process. It requires trust. It occurs in an environment that respects the learners and their differences. It's facilitated by teachers, professionals who care about children and who care about equity. And those teachers are supported by principals, paraprofessional staff, and the school community. And it's all funded by the public for the greater good. It doesn't happen by accident, but it can be dismantled. And I believe this bill is almost a purposeful dismantling of the kind of learning that I think is most useful. So thank you for the opportunity, all of you that came tonight, to listen and to share your ideas. And I'm looking forward to the questions and answers.
Well, if we were all together now, you'd be watching me clapping for you. I think I didn't make a false promise at the beginning. I'm sure that many folks in the audience, if not all of them, would be happy to be sitting down accidentally at a coffee shop or at a restaurant to share a meal or a cup of coffee with all three of you or any one of you. Thanks for sharing from your experience. we will be having some questions, and as they come in, I'm going to ask one to start off. Rebeca spoke about the necessary discomfort involved in education, which I think is something that teachers know and sometimes don't want to admit, because we don't want it to make it look like, you know, there are troubles in there, but there's clear discomfort. And Abby talked about how some of that discomfort, which is, by the way, discomfort is not bad. It's productive, right? It's the thing that happens. Abby spoke about the source of discomfort that comes from a lack of representation. And Leanne spoke, and thank you, Leanne, for grounding us in evidence of student reality, right? Those photos, I think, brought us back to what we're talking about, and why so many people care about it. So my question, and you can, maybe I'll pick up on it while Q&A questions are coming in, is around the question of representation and diversity in schools and decision-making. I know, because I've been watching the press conferences and going to things, that one of the answers that will be given and has been given about issues of representation and voice in schools is, well, that's why we've created school community councils. That's why this bill proposes that every school will have a council. I'm wondering if any of you want to respond to that, because I think that is generally the response that comes to the issue of, wait a second, by removing trustees, you're getting rid of parental voice and replacing them with these central boards. So if anybody wants to tackle that, I will pay attention to the questions that are coming in.
I can just, just briefly say that I think it's important for everyone who is interested in understanding what Bill 64 is about. I strongly suggest also look at the Public Schools Act and try to see what has actually changed. Because it's very easy to say that things are going to change, but when you look at what is actually being published as change. So one thing that I talked in my presentation was, like, in practical terms, what is changing? You know, are the parents now going to have, going to be able to attend the meetings, and how, in practical terms, how are parents' voice going to be part of that? So I'm just going to leave it there.
I also think that there's a big difference between someone who's elected and paid as a trustee to, the kind of commitment they're going to be able to put across as to volunteer parents. And I think, again, volunteer parents will often come from middle-class families where not both parents are working, or where there are two parents, because you have to have the time and energy to devote to those parent councils, and not every it's just going to wind up, again, privileging certain groups.
Thank you for that, Leanne. I was going to say that we already have parent councils and all these that are happening. That's not going to change much. What I find in the school system, as someone who works with the newcomers, is you are less likely to find representation from refugees, immigrants, people living in poverty, from visible minorities, even in the parent councils of today. It's very unlikely that you will have their voices heard. If you look at the schools in the inner city, specifically the schools in downtown, they actually don't have parent councils. They have volunteers who volunteer to help with the lunch program. They don't have a robust parent council as the many schools in the suburbs have, just because they have more struggles to deal with. Now, we are going to deal with an additional layer of discrimination. When you have the majority of the schools, the majority of the kids coming from one voice, if you have, for example, a vote on ideas that's brought to the minister, where are the needs of this majority of the kids, many of who are coming from vulnerable groups who are struggling? Where are they going to go? They will just be whitewashed, because out of all this representation on the Parent Advisory Council, you'll have one vote. It has no meaning whether you have a parent council in every school, not at all.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I'm looking at questions coming in here, and there's lots of fertile terrain. So I'm gonna start this one right here from Leslie. So there was a statement, and actually I think it was in Leanne's, or I think it was in Leanne's presentation, where the term respect for diversity is used. So I'm wondering if and this is the question, I'm wondering if the panelists could speak more about the notion of the passive tolerance of diversity, as opposed to maybe other ways to conceive of diversity.
There is something in Canada that is very common, is multiculturalism. And the idea that we can all be together and that's fine, you know, and I think more, not just me, but others also spoke about this idea of tolerance. And to tolerate diversity means I am superior and you can exist, you can be there, but I'm the ruler here. That's kind of what is behind this idea of tolerance. So you can exist, but as I mentioned, it can only stretch so far. So there is no breaking of the shape that is already existing. It's only working in the elastics of the system. Whereas truly welcoming to diversity is, I know it's hard. It bothers us. And we have a tendency of refusing, avoiding anything. It's normal, psychologically normal for us to avoid and to reject anything that goes against what we believe in what it's comfortable for us, right? It's only normal, it's our survival mode. And then it goes back to the previous question about allowing parents' voices, minority voices to come in, because our tendency is to push those away. But when we talk about actually welcoming diversity and true, genuine welcoming, or genuine welcoming to diversity, it's actually embracing this discomfort that things are not going to be as I want. So that's the problem I see strongly in Canada as a whole, and then looking at in Bill 64 is exactly accepting, so making everything very comfortable. Yes, everybody can coexist, and there is something very important too that I didn't talk in my presentation, which is this the diversity statement. There was already present in the Public School Act, which is so passive. It's like, oh yeah, if there is any gay alliance, yeah, you can exist, you can do it, like we can accommodate. So everything is just like a matter of, yes, we can accommodate, right? So everything is very passive, everything is very like, as long as, so let's just put a flag, let's put a rainbow there and everything is fine, right? But what is actually changing? That remains to be answered.
Thanks. I think my own teaching experience is that the recognition that really welcoming diversity it's hard work, right? Yeah, and it's really rewarding though, really necessary. Yeah. Unless someone wants to jump in on that, I have a question here that says, I'm troubled that there's nothing in Bill 64 that references or reflects the calls to action of the TRC. It says, actually, maybe Leanne, you want to take the first shot at this. It says, Dr. Block, how can this be addressed in the most powerful way possible. Who can we encourage to speak about what and in what venue?
I mean, yes. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know who, I mean, the best people to speak to this are Indigenous parents, Indigenous educators, and Indigenous faculty. But the rest of us have to speak about it too. And I think what Rebeca said in her presentation about how success is defined in this bill, or how it's defined in a kind of homogeneous way, that has to be addressed almost before you can ask the bill to respond to the calls to the TRC. It has to be addressed. We have to talk about how students don't all look the same, think the same, come from the same context. And teachers have been saying that, and principals have been saying that, and educators have been saying that for a long time now. But I feel like this bill is really about modernization. It's about cutting out that kind of discourse that we've been building up in the school gradually in the last 30 years, and taking it back to some kind of, I don't know, father knows best kind of reality that, as Abdi said, doesn't exist. That's not who are the students in our schools.
Yeah. Well addressed. I'll just call attention. Val Vint, the artist, has suggested that we should have grandmothers' councils in schools, and I think that's an idea with some merit, and an idea, by the way, that St. John's High School used for a while.
They still have, I think.
Okay, excellent. So I usually don't engage with anonymous questions, just because I want to value transparency. However, there's a statement by an anonymous attendee that says, great presentations, which they were and continue to be. It says, poverty is a real issue for all reasons stated, but reflects health, public safety, etc. And it's not an education focus issue. Needs to be administered by other areas of government, society, and not education. So that's an assertion that I've heard. I'm wondering if anybody wants to respond to the idea that poverty it's a serious issue, but not an education issue.
You know, Marc, I find that comment, no disrespect to the person who wrote it, but I find it hilarious. Because how do you teach a kid on a hungry stomach? That's the only question that I need to ask you. How do you teach a kid on a hungry stomach and expect them to perform and learn and become the future leaders of this country? Education involves bringing all sorts of resources at the disposal of students so that they become the best brains for the future. If you do not invest in education from all aspects, then you are failing your country and your system and what you want to be as a country, I think. So poverty is an issue for education, front, back, middle, on every part of it. You cannot teach kids. You cannot have kids come to school on hungry stomach and expect them to learn.
I think, I mean, speaking as an educator, and when I taught inner city education at the U of W, and this is something that I kind of emphasize, and maybe it's not I'm going to disagree with Abby, but just maybe to add a different lens as well. As an educator, when I enter the classroom, I don't think it's my job in that particular moment as one single person, Rebeca, to feed the students. It's impossible for me to have baskets in my classroom to feed them. But I think poverty does matter because there are a lot of things involved in poverty. So for instance, a student that lives in poverty might for example, have share the house with 10 people and not be able to sleep well, and then the student is going to be in the classroom sleeping on their desk. What is my first tendency when I see that is, oh, this student's not paying attention. I'm going to be, because it's an offense to me, right? Because he's not paying attention to my class. But then there's where our understanding of, and by understand what I'm saying, by understanding, my knowledge of the reality of kids and my sensitivity and my tact, that there is something going on there that is not an offense to me. So what is the reality? What is the uniqueness of that student? And then that's where I think understanding poverty and what poverty might entail in the life of a student, that's where, on a daily basis, my role as an educator, that's where I think would come. So addressing and relating to students according to their reality.
Poverty is a social issue, and it's systemic, and it needs to be dealt with, as the writer said, at all levels of government. But it's also just a reality in the classroom, in a lot of the classrooms I ever worked in. And, I did keep little boxes of crackers in my drawer, just because, I was with the little kids, not university kids, because it was necessary. And I thought it was unbelievably crude almost when the premier suggested that he would pay teachers for their out-of-pocket expenses. Like, every teacher has out-of-pocket expenses, but you'd have to keep your, instead of funding the system, if you save your bills for how many cracker boxes you bought in this school year, then you'd get, 10% of it back. It was just it was so unreal to me. Sorry, I just had to throw that in. But that's that very, limited view of what teachers do, and how poverty or racism or homophobia, those big things impact the unique student that Rebeca was talking about.
Well, thanks for that. And yeah, I wish I still had my receipts. But I'd suggest one thing for anybody interested. It's something that lots of us do in the faculty at the U of W, and I'm sure at the U of M and in Brandon too, is the United Way has put together a online poverty simulation, which doesn't address all the systemic roots of it, but it does engage you. And if you just Google, United Way poverty simulation Winnipeg, you'll find it. It's an enlightening exercise to engage in, because it really puts light to the lie that poverty is solely, or even really much of an individual outcome, and how a lot of the things that Rebeca and was talking about, how they turn into behaviors that are judged, when in fact they're expressions of love. Some of the actions families take are expressions of love that get judged as expressions of neglect. Anyhow, great source. I think we have time for maybe one or two. Or Rebeca, did you want to jump in before I go to this?
I just want to add one thing, because I think it's very important, especially also in light of what Abdi said. And yeah, I think it's very important just to put out there that I believe there's something else also beyond economic status, which is racism. Racism is not poverty. So I think racism is a major issue that can go perhaps even beyond poverty, especially here in our context in Winnipeg. I think we cannot just address poverty, okay? We have to address racism, because someone who is Black and poor is even worse welcome, if you can say it this way, than someone who is white and poor. So, but speaking about race is very, very uncomfortable. And this is something that educators often avoid. So I think we have to talk about race, and we have to talk about racism, and not just about economics.
Yeah, good, really good point. And we have to address the fact that we have to accept the fact that schools, whether we address these issues or not, schools are where we normalize our ideas about what's normal in society, right? That's where we get those ideas about, segregation and inequity and as being acceptable, because the trusted adults who took care of us for 13 years, and I'm not bashing teachers because teachers are put in the anyway, the question is, I'm concerned that among other things, Bill 64 will remove the local voice of parents and community members in their local school systems. I don't see school community councils as equivalent to elected school trustees who have real decision-making authority. And I should say, I don't think anyone here spoke saying like, that the system was perfect before Bill 64. So I don't want people to think that in comparing trustees to councils, we're necessarily saying the existing system was good or great or whatever. We're just saying, am I correct in being concerned that Bill 64 will silence or marginalize marginalize many voices, visible and invisible minorities, indigeneity, newcomers? So am I correct in being concerned about this? A related question, and sorry for raising the nuclear option, but does this bill infringe on the charter rights of some students and parents? Which I don't know if anyone has a charter law background.
I was expecting that Dr. Lian will jump for it. She's the most educated amongst all of us. I have no idea about charter rights, Marc, but here's all that I'll say. And I really wanted to say this is, when you look at the trajectory of this reform process, it's really a systematic discrimination of visible minority, immigrants, refugee people. When you look at how the commission was formed, when you look at the Parent Advisory Council, when you look at the Parent Engagement Council, when you look at the Parent Advisory Council that's going to be formed, when you look at what's in the bill, when you look at the content that's being taken out, it's really a way to say that we don't want people who look different in this province. Really, to be honest with you, that is the thing. What worries me though is that we bill ourselves as a place of immigration. We want to welcome more newcomers. We want to work hard. We want to make sure that our economy is driven by immigration. But we fail to do that. I don't know, maybe these folks have an idea of immigration from a different source. Maybe Western Europe, this is the idea, I don't know. But when it comes to immigration from a different source that looks different from the majority of the people who live in rural Manitoba, this bill and how it was crafted, the trajectory was really aimed as a systemic discrimination against visible minority people.
Any other comments on this question around voice?
I think that what you said, Abdi, is true, but I think it's almost like the immigrants are welcomed as long as they don't want to be different, right? So as long as they become part of an economic system and go and work in various places and are quiet, then it's a good thing to have immigrants. But immigrants who want to change the educational system to reflect, who want internationally educated teachers in the schools, those immigrants, are less welcome. So it goes back to what Rebeca was saying about, and other speakers in this series, about this sort of homogenous idea of what Manitoba is and what it looks like, that just is unreal and unreal.
And that put me in a very uncomfortable or maybe tricky position, because I am an immigrant here. And so who is this person that arrived, so raw in this country? And I was already like talking about the reformation, the education reform, like with what authority is she saying? And I have already like I've done lots of research with immigrants, and what I hear over and over and over again is on the first moment, like this gratitude for being here. But then it's interesting that people would come here, for example, with major degrees from their countries, and they have to start from the bottom, right? I speak for myself. And it's, and you see this in many areas, and then education is the same thing. And as I conduct my research with Black refugees, you know, what I am pointing out there is the same thing about education. Not the fact that you receive, you know, a refugee is not enough. Does not mean that the student feel welcome in your classroom. There is a lot more to that. So there is this, what an academic called Barbara Aron says, this helping imperative that is particular of white nations like Canada, that is this, I have to help, you know, and then as soon as you let the people come, you know, you put the student in the classroom, oh yes, we have a Black, we have, you know, someone from LGBTQ community, we have an Indigenous student, and you check all the boxes, and you think everything is fine, but it's not about that. It's about really that discomfort of the change, and to what extent are we actually willing to embrace this discomfort?
All right, that is to what degree are we willing to embrace the discomfort is a great question. And by the way, Rebeca, thank you for having the courage to speak your truth and your insights, despite that threat, a threat that many folks like me don't realize people are feeling, right? Because you have a different experience than I do. So I appreciate that. I don't want it to be lost on anyone. I'll say this, I do have sympathy for, and I'm sure people get mad at me, I have sympathy for those who see education as a managerial task. Because it must be very frustrating to create elegant systems of governance that seem to be very efficient and then have people complain. And I would say that what you've pointed out here tonight is that education is more like a family process. And if anybody out there has had somebody adopted into their family, or somebody who they've taken as part of their family, you know what happens. Your family changes, because that's what humans do when they come into relationship with new people. And that's what I think many of you have brought up tonight, is that fundamental process of community building and navigating with the hard work of living together well across differences is going to be made harder by this bill. So I really, really appreciate your work. I hope it gives energy to everybody to see the value of discussing these things. And I would say, we had one last comment that says, what resistance is possible? I would say, like Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government we have, except for all the others. So, you know, whatever channels we can, let's use them and do this in good faith, because our schools are at stake.